So this week, we're going to start looking into our final essay, essay number 3, where you get to create your own argument. Before you decide on a topic, this week what I would like to do is you begin to think about your topic to see if there's enough research out there. Is I want you to look at your own personal bias. So what is bias? And, generally we kind of think of it as something negative. And it can be negative, but it doesn't have to be negative. We've been looking at bias all semester, but we've been calling them warrants. And basically those warrants, there are assumptions about the topic. They're not synonymous, but they're related. And a lot of times our bias comes from our warrants, our objections to some of these arguments when we can't put our finger on them. They are those personal beliefs that underlie our topics that we're not always aware of. And so the research I've been doing is looking at when students go and they start researching a topic, they generally know sort of what side they want to argue. And this kind of bias can really influence how you do your research. What happens when you go to a topic, when you go to your research, already knowing the side? Well, you choose research that reinforces that side. So we're going to look at our own beliefs, where they come from. And it doesn't mean they're wrong, and it doesn't mean we have to change them, but we need to be aware that those beliefs are there, how they influence us. Not to be afraid of them, not to be afraid or defensive to mention them, but so that we can be sure that we approach these issues with an open mind, okay? So when you look at your stance, where you come from, okay, you need to be sure that you understand your personal bias. So each of us has a set of assumptions, ideas or attitude, facts that we take for granted that underlie our thinking. Only when you're willing to look at these assumptions and realize how they color your conclusions can you examine situation, problems, or issues objectively. So assumptions are based on a number of factors: physical, environmental, psychological, experiential. They're often automatic and unconscious ways that come to bear on issues. So one of the first things we need to do is to examine what those factors are that influence our consciousness. So one of them is the senses, and this is the most elemental way that we tend to react to things, particularly things that are different. The smell of a neighborhood, maybe a particular kind of cooking. It can be a very strong reaction that we have. And like I said, it does not mean it's wrong, but we need to understand that we are reacting on a sensory level and that we're reacting because it's different and we're not used to it. Experience. We each have a unique set of experiences, and they influence our responses to what we encounter. So ultimately, as critical thinkers, we have to understand both how past experience might limit our thinking in a situation, or how we can use it to see things more clearly. So what experiences have you had that influence the way you may feel about social issues or legislation? So for example, I think experience can work both ways. A lot of times experience can give us a more open mind because we understand the need of a particular issue because we have experienced it ourselves. So take, for example, mental illness. If you've had a family member or someone who experiences mental illness, then you can sort of understand the situation that families are in when they deal with that. Maybe the limited number of resources, the inability to get help for someone who's over 18 years old. Those are experiences that really shape who we are. And I think in those ways they can be very mind-opening. In other ways, experiences might limit our thinking because we think like, oh, this is what I observe, this is what I see, this is where I work. And so you have a very small picture of the issue, but to you it's a very accurate picture, but it may not be the whole picture. In one of my other classes, a student talked about working in a grocery store. And so sort of seeing what each customer buys and how that influences her opinion of society. But again, it might be representative of that particular grocery store and its customers or the shift that she works, but it's not necessarily representative of society as a whole. And so we have to be aware that our experience can be limiting. Like I said, it can also give us insight, but we need to be aware of it and how it influences the issue. So when you look at an issue, you want to examine your past experiences with that issue or your lack of them. That maybe that's why you don't have a particular insight into that issue. Our values. Values are deeply held beliefs. We learn them from family, school, and peers. And they're the way we think the world should be. These givens may be difficult even to recognize, let alone reject. The thing about values that I find difficult when I'm teaching is we sort of have an assumption that value means something very specific, when in reality we all have very different values. And again, we may not be even aware of what those values are because we haven't named them, but they're often associated maybe with certain things. So some people may value, say, freedom or honesty. And so you would really have to kind of look at your actions, look at the decisions you think should be made about the world, and then kind of examine then what do I think is most important. And I think from a writing perspective, when you write about values, you have to define them. You can't assume that the reader agrees with you or agrees that there is a common definition of value. I see this a lot in social topics. Anything that involves gender or family. We talk a lot about family values. But again, those things are different for everyone. So from a writer's perspective, you have to define them, what they are, what you're calling them. You can't assume that your audience has that same set. Emotions. Recognizing our emotional reactions is vital to keep them from influencing our conclusions. So particularly when issues, involve something like a child abuser or, even welfare fraud, we tend to let our emotions sort of become center. That because we have this indignance at this event, then it gives us the right to sort of advocate for the most extreme solution. Not saying we shouldn't, but you need to recognize that the way you feel can color your perceptions. And again, it's not that that bias is wrong. I feel like we should be angry at people who abuse children. But when we do our research, why, how much it happens, those sorts of things, we still have to keep our emotions at bay and approach it in an academic way. Culture. So culture can be a lot of things, and we live in many different cultures. You have a culture of your peer group. You have a culture of what, maybe what you grew up in, like an ethnicity. You have a school culture. You have a work culture. So all of those cultures maybe have slightly different rules, and they push us into thinking certain ways. And so I had one student give an example that she grew up in a very Hispanic, in a culture that was Hispanic with very conservative values or roles for women, but those weren't the things she necessarily believed in now. So what was her greater influence? And really, I would say her influence is culture. She has sort of two opposing cultures, but she's been influenced by the American culture she lives in. And then prior knowledge. What did we know about an issue beforehand? So it could be personal experience, secondhand accounts, something we watched on the news. And so when we look at that prior knowledge, we have to really evaluate, is it true? Does it matter? Is it even relevant? How does it relate? And it may be that sort of influences in thinking that we have the whole picture of the issue, and we need to be aware that we really may not, that we may only have a slight bit of it. And finally, our religion. Obviously our religious backgrounds, whether we still practice them or not, can be very powerful over the way we think. Even if we've sort of changed our minds, or I feel like a lot of times we can sort of allow, like, well, I wouldn't do this, but it's okay if the rest of society does this. How does that influence us? Where do those come from? What has your past or your current religion, how does that influence the way you think? And again, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It doesn't mean that you should not think that way. It just means to recognize where those beliefs come from, what's influencing you. And finally, common sense. This is my favorite one. So we have a large store of information that everybody knows that we apply to new situations and problems. Unfortunately, the fact that everybody knows it doesn't make it right. Sometimes common sense ways of thinking can be very, very simplistic. They may serve you well, like on a day-to-day basis, but in those larger issues and those legislative issues, sometimes I find that common sense doesn't always anticipate future problems. It never really anticipates exceptions or the flexibility that may be needed in a law. And it's just, I think, a way for people to justify a feeling. But it's just the way it is. It's common sense. And so you don't really have to reason it out. You don't have to apply logical thinking or facts to it. So you do want to be wary of sort of invoking the common sense argument when you go to look at an issue. Really look at the facts of that issue and don't presuppose some type of general knowledge that you may or may not have. So one of the activities you can do with this, I had my face-to-face class kind of look at an issue, and some of the issues we looked at were, should girls ask guys out on dates? Another one was, are same-sex schools effective? And so you can really pick sort of any hot button issue. There was another one, should we force race car drivers to use biofuels? Pick a side on the issue. So yes, we should make race car drivers pick biofuels. Or no, schools should be integrated, not segregated. Pick whatever your side of the issue is. And then looking back at the PowerPoint, kind of decide what has influenced you to take that side. Is it a religious belief? Is it a cultural belief? Where do those sort of where do your beliefs come from? Okay, and so this is just simply to kind of get you prepared for your topic. So as you're thinking about possible topics, look at your biases. Do you have prior experience with this? And again, it's not that those beliefs are not okay. Okay, it just means that you need to be aware of them as you go into the research process, so that you do keep an open mind during the research process, rather than going into the research process already choosing a side on the issue. All right, let me know if you have any questions.